Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we are going to be discussing how the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny of 1783 created the District of Columbia, aka Washington, D.C. So, back in 1783, the Revolutionary War had come to a conclusion, and they were just kind of sitting around waiting for the Treaty of Paris to be ratified and the war to be officially over. But this didn't necessarily sit well with all the soldiers, especially the soldiers in the Pennsylvania Line in 1783, who had not yet been paid for much of their service, and they certainly wanted to be paid. They were told they'd be paid, and they weren't just fighting in the war for their liberties, as we like to think. Many of them were fighting because they wanted to be paid. Unfortunately, the Continental Congress didn't have a lot of money to pass around, and since it seemed like the war was going to end and these guys were just going to be sent home with no pay, they decided to mutiny, and they walked over to the Pennsylvania State House, what we now know as Independence Hall, which is pictured to my right. They go over there and they say, hey, come outside, Continental Congressman, and it's convenient because this is when the Continental Congressmen were leaving for the day, and they walk outside, and there's the Pennsylvania Line mutinying, and they are essentially saying, pay us now or we might get rough with you. Fortunately for the delegates to the Continental Congress, among them was a young man named Alexander Hamilton. Yes, the same Alexander Hamilton who had just 2 years beforehand made quite an impression on many of the soldiers, leading an attack on a redoubt at Yorktown and becoming a hero to many of these very people. Now, Hamilton stood up and said, hey, I'm one of you guys. And they looked around and said, yeah, you're Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton said, well, tell you what, guys, you go home tonight. We'll go home tonight, and we'll reconvene in the morning as the Continental Congress and decide what we can do to pay you guys. And, they took Alexander Hamilton at his word, which some might say is a mistake, because they went home. Hamilton and a few other members of the Continental Congress met in a committee with members of the Pennsylvania state government. And they asked the Pennsylvania state government for protection of the state militia from the Continental Army. Now, we should note that at this point, John Dickinson, another famous American revolutionary, was in charge. He was president of state of Pennsylvania, what we would now consider governor, and Dickinson meets with Hamilton and these other gentlemen from the Congress that he was once a part of, and he says, I can't give you the state militia to suppress the Continental Army. And this is a little bit surprising to our ears, but Dickinson's reasoning was, hey, first of all, I don't think the militia will fight the Continental Army. They were just very recently on the same side, and it is the state of Pennsylvania's militia versus Pennsylvania's line in the Continental Army. That's not going to go over too swimmingly. Second of all, the Continental Army at this point was pretty well trained, and state militias just were still not very well trained, so why would they walk into the slaughter? And third of all, how can we start essentially another civil war because the Continental Congress isn't paying what they promised? This, of course, had been a long time problem. So the decision was made by Hamilton and the rest of the Continental Congress to instead of showing up the next day and discussing how to pay these soldiers, they would not show up the next day and run away to New Jersey. And this was a solution for the time. It worked. Interestingly enough, no Congress on the national scale would meet in Pennsylvania for another decade until after the Constitution was ratified and the decision was made to temporarily stay in Philadelphia while Washington, D.C. was constructed. Now, what does this have to do with Washington, D.C., you ask? It's in the thumbnail. Well, see, this really struck at the hearts of many of the American founders. And I want a side note here. John Dickinson, who would not relinquish the state militia, would go and serve at the Constitutional Convention. So don't freak out on him too much. But while they were there, and shortly thereafter, the discussion was, how do we suppress this type of insurrection in the future? And the conclusion was, we need to create a federal district because we want the federal government to have control over the army and control over all police forces within the district so that in case of a mutiny, we can suppress it. Or in case of an insurrection or anything of that nature, it's up to the federal government to defend itself, essentially, as opposed to rely on the generosity of whatever state the federal capital happens to be in. And that is, in essence, why Washington, D.C. is its own place. It's interesting. I don't like to talk about modern politics on this channel, but there has been some discussion of DC statehood. And again, I'm not going to tell you which side of the line I fall on, but I do want to remind you that the reason that DC is not a state is so that the federal government can control all policing action within the district, as opposed to relying on state forces. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a little bit something about the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny of 1783 and how it affects us still today. If you did enjoy this, definitely hit like. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution all week long. So I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.